Welcome back. I hope the bickies were good in your kitchen, and a big thank you to our breaks sponsor, MSCI. Well, every year at the AXI conference, we put a group of directors under the microscope and try and get a better handle on what's focusing the minds of the leaders of some of our biggest companies. And the mere fact that we're not in the same room together does highlight, of course, some of the extraordinary challenges that face boards today. There's working from home, as most of us are doing, supply chain disruptions, economic and consumer uncertainty. And that's on top, of course, of the increasing challenges presented by what we could call the more known issues, for want of a better description, as we've just been talking about climate change, also modern slavery, there's cybersecurity, regulatory challenges, and an investment community that's focused more than ever on what business is doing on all of the above. So what is exercising the minds of those sitting around boardrooms today? And again, just a reminder, the full bios of our panel members are on the conference hub. But joining you for this discussion are Catherine Livingstone, Chair of the Commonwealth Bank, Diane Smith-Gander, Non-Executive Director of AGL Energy and Non-Executive Chair of Zipco, and John Mullen, Chair of Telstra Corporation and Executive Chair of the Toll Group. So a very warm virtual welcome to our panel this morning. So let's get straight to it. And given where we find ourselves this Wednesday with 3 capital cities and 2 entire states, in fact, in lockdown, I think it's half the Australian population, it seems appropriate to start with the pandemic. So Catherine, can I start with you? How worried are you as a bank about the economic damage?
Well, I think, Ali, I mean, there's no doubt that this is causing disruption and damage. But having said that, I think we have now quite a lot of experience over 18 months, unfortunately, I suppose, in how best to manage the situation. And I think the cooperation between business and government and regulators cut in immediately, really, in this instance. All of the working from home protocols, which we have, reverted immediately. So I think we're better prepared this time, obviously. And also there is a way out that we know will work if the vaccination rates increase. So I think that provides a more positive sentiment, if we can say there's something positive at the moment. There's more that's perhaps known about the way forward than we had, for example, a year ago.
And of course, I mean, vaccines is the only way out of this, really. But given the challenges we face on the vaccine front, how do you think business can help build a path out of this? I mean, you don't hold the vaccine, just like the Prime Minister didn't hold a hose, but what's the role for business as we move out of this pandemic?
Well, I think really encouraging people to get vaccinated and providing as much information as we can. I think, as you know, business has been talking to government about whether it can actually host vaccination programs, and that's something that's under discussion. Of course, it has complexities in and of itself, but business being very positive about the need for vaccination and really encouraging and providing the facts to our people is crucial in this. We need to get that momentum up.
John, has Telstra's operations been changed forever by COVID, by the pandemic?
Yeah, I think so. One of the interesting things about this pandemic that nobody foretold, of course, but the economic impact's been very patchy. It's very different to the GFC, for example, in that there are some real winners out of this. Digitization is one, and the ability to work from home and adapt to a digital environment has just exploded across the board. But we've seen lots of winners, and online retailers and supermarkets, Bunnings of the world and things, and a switch from consumption of services to consumption of actual physical goods, which is why air freight rates and things have gone up 10 times, etc. So I think big companies, in many ways, will benefit from the whole experience. We've learned a lot. We've digitized much quicker than we would have done before. I think the main economic damage, sadly, is to small business and your cafes and restaurants, small retailers, which sort of held up reasonably well first time around with the JobKeeper subsidies, but you can't do that forever. And I think while big business will, in many cases, change for the better. Small business won't, and that's probably the biggest damage to our economy.
And John, in boardrooms, is it also, I guess, you know, we've always talked about black swan events, but this has been the ultimate one, hasn't it? I mean, this was a risk that really hadn't been mapped in boardrooms.
Yeah, I do smile ruefully that, you know, all of us in big companies, in the board, we have these the risk matrix with the bubbles against severity and likelihood, and we all spend hours poring over them and adapting them and moving the bubbles. And then every time there is a real crisis, it was never on the matrix in the first place. Most of the ones I've been involved with, and that was the case there. And, you know, well, Telstra had all sorts of recovery plans if one contact center went down or one area was impacted. No one ever assumed that all of the customer service centers overseas and in Australia would shut down the same day, virtually. That was just never envisaged.
At least you can take comfort from the fact that it would appear that the government didn't map that one either. Diane, can I bring you in here and ask you how the environment has changed with COVID, do you think? I mean, we know the supply chain and the operational challenges, but what about the role of governments and even the regulators? I want to say it seems the remit is bigger, the accountability smaller. Is that fair?
I think that's very fair, Ali, and it's great to be with you. I'm over here on Wajak Nama Buja, so let me pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we see things differently in WA.
Well, you're not in lockdown for one thing, can I just say that? You're the only one.
And haven't we, I think, come to a tipping point, as you said before, half the population in lockdown, our two largest cities simultaneously in lockdown. And I think John and Catherine have absolutely said it, that business really leans in hard and is in rhythm on how to work through this environment and is working well with government. But I think that now is the moment for a bigger aspiration to really step in and say, what is it that we should be doing to live with COVID in a COVID-safe way and to be able to keep our economy moving? John is right, those small businesses are not going to come back. So we need new settings to be able to replace that economic activity. I think what we've seen is that governments have stepped behind the health advice and said, this really is about the science, we need to follow the science. But this is emerging science. We don't have a lot of history. It's why we can't say vaccination is a control that must be in the workplace, because we just don't know how well the vaccines are really going to perform as we step through the pandemic. So I think we've seen government expand its role in some places, but almost desert the field in others. And it's this aspiration that we should have to collaborate better, to go back to the days of the high-functioning national cabinet, which brought the federation together. So I think really, as Catherine said, we need to encourage our staff members to have the vaccine. We need to speak to our customers because there is a void there in what our aspiration should be. And I think business can step into that, needs to step into that to fill that vacuum. And then hopefully we'll be able to have our governments get a bit more courage around the aspiration. You know, you said this was black swan. You know, if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and look at Goal 11 and Goal 15, if we'd actually achieved those, safe cities and sustainable terrestrial ecosystems, we wouldn't have had coronaviruses in the way that we have, because we would have understood the damage that we were doing more, and we would have understood that safe cities was about COVID safe cities, coronavirus safe cities. So I do think it's a very interesting dynamic that we're facing into that needs big aspiration.
And Graham, when you talk about business stepping into that aspiration, what are you talking about there? Are you talking about learning to live with it, not shutting borders at the drop of a hat? I mean, are we at that point yet? And particularly given, I suppose, the political side of this and what government is obviously playing to, which is a community that doesn't want to let it rip.
I don't believe that Australia can turn itself into a bunch of isolated states. We've got an open economy. It's been globally open for a very long time, but certainly, you know, while I think we have had a lot of messaging that has driven people to go, oh, here in Western Australia, we're this, that and the other. We need to break through that. I think it's very, very dangerous. And government has been quite timid on policy settings for the last decade. We've had a lot of politics and very little good public policy. I don't think business can sit on the sidelines and allow that to continue. I think what business people need to do is to start to talk very forcefully about the need to keep borders open within Australia, to get the population vaccinated, and to start to aspire to things like we heard from Canada this week, that they'll accept fully vaccinated travellers across their international borders. I really am concerned that our aspiration is too low.
John, do you agree the aspiration is too low? And if you do, I guess, how optimistic are you that the government is listening to business? Oh, John, you're on mute, I think.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, there you are. Good, got you.
So it didn't change anything.
That's that digital society that we live in.
I'm not trying to be too critical, but I think we have seen a slightly unedifying spectacle of some state governments spending as much time scoring political points off each other as they have helping the populations and the economies. And I think it highlights some of our challenges as a federal model. It's been extremely difficult for a federal government of any persuasion to deal as quickly with this issue as perhaps is done in New Zealand or other places where you've got a single structure. So I think, look, in the end, it has to be led by government. I absolutely agree with Dan and with Catherine. We've been a victim of our own success in that I think by keeping COVID out, people sort of subliminally at least thought, well, there's no panic and no rush to get myself vaccinated. I concede I was even like that. Well, I'm going to do it. I'm not anti-vaxxer, and I have done. I would like you to know now, but at the time, I thought, well, it's not a panic. I can do it next week. And as a result, we've turned success into, unfortunately, a situation where we're sort of lagging many other countries now that stuffed up the first round, but they got the vaccination right. So I think business has an absolute obligation to support government as far as it can. I think it's going to lead to some very interesting legal challenges. I mean, can you prevent somebody coming to work if they're not vaccinated? All sorts of interesting things like that coming out. With one of my corporate hats on, we had the first case of an employee on their laptop in a conference just like this, and walking downstairs at home, fell downstairs, hurt himself, broke their laptop, lodged a workers' compensation claim, because she was at work, and that was upheld. So, I mean, that's another. So now we have an obligation to keep the workplace safe, but we are not actually allowed as a corporation to go into that workplace because it's your private home. So it's going to change the world, hopefully for the better. But yeah, we've got some interesting times ahead, I think.
Catherine, can I bring you in here and ask, do you agree with that? I mean, I'm really surprised by that example around the workplace, that you can't enter because it's someone's home, but yet you are responsible for it. I mean, the pandemic has changed the game, hasn't it?
Look, it absolutely has. And can I just come back to the aspiration and where business can play a role? Australia is where Australia is. We are where we are now. So it's a question of where do we go from here? And it's clear that the community is uncomfortable with a concept of just living with the Delta virus. So we're trying to suppress it. We do need vaccination rates. We do have a major problem that our international borders are closed, and all businesses are suffering with the inability to get the people they need. Whether it's small business, large business, we are in a crisis point in terms of skills. We can't get people to come to Australia because they're worried about being locked in and trapped here. So we really have a focus, let's say, to the end of the year. Get vaccinated, live through these lockdowns, have the support from business and from government, and have the aspiration that by the end of the year, we should be in a position to not only have our state borders open, but international borders really on a timeline for opening from that point. That's the ambition that we should have collectively. So business, government and regulators.
And would you like to see government actually enunciate that and not just talk about horizons, which of course are usually not met, but actually put some dates on it, be very specific about what we can achieve?
Well, I think so, because unless, I mean, I understand why people might be reluctant to put timelines on it, because then it becomes an ostensible commitment. But we're talking here about ambition. And I think we should have that ambition, and hence business encouraging our staff and our customers to get vaccinated, to get behind that ambition, because the closed borders are not good for the country.
Kath, Ali, can I just say, Catherine, thank you for putting such clarity around that. I think you're absolutely spot on. When I say aspiration, that's a vague concept, and you put real clarity on what business needs. I'm 100% with what you've just said.
And Catherine, the other issue, and we just talked about it very briefly, John was talking about how quickly, everyone went digital, which really did only serve to underline the extent to which we do live in a digital world. And this brings me to this question of board skills and skill sets and what it takes to be digitally capable. Do you think, Catherine, that we do have digitally capable boards in this country? I don't mean one person responsible for cybersecurity. I mean that depth of understanding that all businesses really need now.
Well, I think we could certainly improve it. Ali, I was reading an interesting analysis that said the performance of a board in the context of a digital capability really needed at least 3 of the board members, so let's say 3 out of 9 or 10, to be very conversant with technology and the digital environment. And at that level, then that was reflected in the performance of the overall board in terms of that digital competency, which I think is quite interesting. But I think my perspective would be that every director on a board should be comfortable with a digital environment, digital concepts, digital business models, because that's the way business is now. It's not something sort of high technology unusual. It is business as usual. So I do think that as an overall comment, we could certainly increase the digital competency of directors generally across the board. I mean, there are obviously some very competent directors in this domain, but we do need to pick up that overall competency if Australia is to be as competitive as it needs to be. And
John, if you can take off your Telstra hat and put on your toll hat, I mean, you lived and breathed this last year, didn't you?
I would 100% agree with Catherine that digital, I mean, it's a big word, digital, it covers so many things today, but every director's got to be conversant. You can have 1 or 2 absolute experts in cybersecurity or something, but every director's got to get their heads around it, because it's part of every business's life, whether it be digital disruption from competition, which I don't think there's a single industry that isn't impacted one way or another, and then the cybersecurity, as you just mentioned. Toll was hit twice, and I believe over 80% of companies that are hit are often hit twice, which was no consolation. I don't think Toll was any better or worse than any other industrial, sort of normal industrial company in Australia. So Telstra's probably at a different level due to its obviously its core sort of infrastructure capabilities for government, etc. But Toll was just a pretty ordinary position, and it was absolutely devastating. And I mean, it could literally have been life-threatening. And if you've got a business of 45,000 employees in 50 countries, and you suddenly can't bill, you can't issue an invoice, that's several $100 million a week of cash impact on the business, and no company can stand that forever. So fortunately, obviously, we sort of got through it and certainly didn't pay a ransom. But there's a lesson in there, I think, for every director of every board. You just cannot be too careful. You've got to be across it.
And Diane, I mean, especially, for example, with AGL, critical infrastructure, it's just as important as any other company. What are your thoughts on, I mean, not just the cyber side, but the digital capability on our boards?
Boards need to be learning organisms. We try to give line of sight to the skills that the directors have through the skills matrix. but there are many ways of writing a skills matrix. But it always intrigues me that most attention is given to what a director did during their executive career. It's more than a decade since I was in my executive career. And I would say that the experiences that I've had over the last 12 years have been way more important to determining the skills that I'm now bringing into the mix as a director. So at Zip, for example, we're a fintech, so tech and digital is everything we do. And we've spent a huge amount of time there with the directors directly involved in the cyber issues, the digital development of our tech stack and so forth. And in fact, if I was to stand outside and watch what goes on in that Zip boardroom and some of the other forums that the directors come together, it almost feels like fingers in rather than noses in and fingers out. But I think as you're building that skill set and that learning orientation on your board, you have to make sure that you're having enough of the direct experience to be a meaningful contributor. So I'd like to see a better way of interrogating just how boards are learning and developing. I had a wonderful experience at Wesfarmers when Paul Bassett came onto the board. He was a very different director than Wesfarmers had in the past. And you could see the new DNA just getting injected in the way that he thought differently and the type of questions that he posed. And he made us realise, individually and collectively, where some of our blind spots were. And so I think this constant refresh, and, some people said when Paul left after 2 terms of 3 years, so 6 years, went a bit early. Well, I think we need to be able to accept having directors with these special skills come on. I'm not sure millennials want to come onto corporate boards and stay for 9 or 12 years. So we might have to get more fleet of foot in the way we bring people into the boardroom to get that injection into our DNA, but then keep the sort of stability and history that a board is supposed to have around stewarding strategy and supporting a CEO.
And John, if I'm right, I think your latest board appointment, one of the youngest women to be on a board in Australia, but you describe it as a labour of love.
Yeah. In the telco world, it's really clear that we all live by social media, by communications, and it's the young generation or younger generations that are actually shaping that future more than my age group. Well, I like to think I'm reasonably technically savvy and I enjoy technology. I wasn't born a digital native. I didn't live and breathe it from birth, which younger people do, and therefore I think it's critically important to have somebody with that perspective helping us around the board table, exactly as Diane was saying. Completely different approach to issues that we would perhaps have previously viewed in a more traditional older person's perspective, and she's challenged us left, right and centre, and I think that's immensely healthy for a board.
If we can turn to ESG expectations and, of course, primarily their climate change, Diane, in particular, the demerger of AGL into CleanCo and CarbonCo, AGL and Accel Energy. Peter Boton put it when he was making the announcement that there's no doubt that the winds have changed substantially faster than many people had anticipated. I'm curious to know, in your view, who's driving those wins? Who's making them move faster? Is it investors? Is it regulators? Is it boards? Like, where is that key momentum coming from?
Well, the key momentum is coming from citizens of the planet who would like to have one in the future. The people that see this as an existential threat, to the world that we live in. And I think everyone is really starting to examine whether this is right. So many voices spread in so many different places. Can they all simultaneously be wrong? Well, absolutely, of course not. So when Peter talks about the pace of change being much faster, if you look at our energy market and the assumptions that are made by all the participants feeding into the market models, you can see that the experience is right at the outer edge of where those assumptions were. So the uptake of distributed energy systems much greater than was expected. The investments in renewables much greater than expected, and therefore the load and the demands on the transmission grid much greater than expected. And so if you really think about the demerger proposal that AGL will put to its shareholders in coming months, is that not the absolute ultimate response to these concern about climate change? To say, let's take AGL Australia, where the customer relationships and the renewable generation sits, and put that in a separate entity that can carve out its path. But then Accel Energy takes in many ways the problem. And it's a problem that we do need to solve. How we maintain that sort of triple goodness of security, reliability and affordability through a sensible decarbonisation transition, recognising that we need to electrify the economy, you know, right across the board to be able to take carbon out. And so we've got to get to green electrons. And as the largest emitter, Accel Energy needs to get it right. If Accel Energy gets it right, then we can get it right for the entire market. So it's a very exciting company to be part of.
It's a huge challenge though, isn't it? I mean, you know, as you said, biggest emitter, just because you split doesn't mean you still don't have the problem. All the problem is now in Accel. How do you meet the challenges as well as the regulatory uncertainty? Is the path forward clear?
Well, it's a focused path now. I think that's the most important thing. I'm a great believer in creativity in Australia, internationally. And like I said, we have an open economy, and Catherine's pointed out how hard it is to get skills here. And that's going to be a really difficult thing for us, because a lot of the skills and experiences that Accel will want to access are in Europe in particular. You look at Germany with the Energiewende transition. These are great learning pathways for us. But think about Accel. It's got these privileged locations with grid connections. It started because it was a place where fossil fuels were. So you get a cheap fuel source to generate your energy cheaply. But over time, that drew transport connections, the grid connections, and a pool of skilled labour. So now those are the privileged assets that are close to those sites, on those sites that Accel is going to own. So it's about how creative can the company be around transforming those into energy hubs. And it won't be something the company will be able to do alone. It's going to be partnerships with government, with other pools of capital, with people that have got technology. Batteries are just scratching the surface. So it can be very exciting, and I think it's the focus that Accel can bring that's the little keystone that's needed to be able to step forward.
And that certainly reflects what we've heard in earlier sessions, that no entity can do this alone. Catherine, we did hear earlier from APRA, who was talking about the climate vulnerability assessment work that it's doing with the banks. What does that look like for an organisation the size of CBA? Clearly understanding the risks with assets. I mean, it's again, I go back to massive job, isn't it?
It's a huge job, but it's a complex system analysis that we have to do. And I think, as most people would agree, and I think Diane's just said, it's not the what that we're debating anymore, it's the how and by when. And we talk about transition. So it's really thinking about over what period, and we've seen the sort of 2050 date now coupled with quite nearer term timelines, so 2030, 2035. And to get to those interim targets is going to require huge investment across the economy. The decarbonisation, the change that has to happen to a lot of infrastructure, as Diane's just laid out. So there is a significant role in financing that decarbonisation, that change to infrastructure. And certainly obviously the banking system is part of providing that financing. So that's on the, if you like, the opportunity side. And then of course there's on the the risk side, making sure that the impact of climate change on whatever assets you hold as a company are fully assessed, and that's where the APRA stress test will come in, obviously on that risk side. But it's also very important that we look at the opportunity side and the sort of products that we can provide to our customers to help them in that transition.
And how do you see the investor focus on climate change? Is this transition process is not smooth, it's incredibly complex, it's going to be expensive, and it's not going to be paved with profit. Do you worry that investors are not necessarily going to be patient while this process is undertaken?
Well, I think that's the key question. And what's behind that is transparency. And I think that's the crucial element that we need to focus on. So if, for example, if investors, they talk about divesting assets that are fossil fuel related, the question is, the divestment itself doesn't stop the emissions. And where do those assets go? And if they go into a less transparent environment, whether it's different operators, private equity, etc., private companies, we will lose sight of those emissions. So investors will lose sight of those emissions. So I think we would argue that transparency is better to provide that view on what is actually being done to enable the transition and hence reduce the emissions. And I think as a bank, we feel we can provide that transparency.
And certainly that divestment versus engagement conversation will continue this afternoon in our investments panel. But John, I mean, like Diane and Catherine, you're in a highly regulated industry. So what does climate risk look like for a telco against the background of your commitment to net zero by 2050?
Well, obviously, telco's not in quite the same situation as an energy company or a large manufacturing enterprise or anything. The predominant use of energy is electricity, which comes from the grid. And in Telstra's case, we've set ourselves an interim stage of generating enough green energy to offset the energy that we use from the grid, because we can't completely divorce ourselves from the grid, of course. But if I could sort of digress slightly, it's a fascinating conversation that you started there, and the comments from my colleagues. The speed with which investor focus has changed is extraordinary. I think five years ago, as a director, you hardly got asked about ESG issues. Last year, for the first time in sort of one of the rounds of investors I did, I spent an entire hour with an investor fund where they didn't ask a single financial question about the company at all. The entire discussion was ESG, which I thought was really insightful. And generalizations are always dangerous, but I see a noticeable difference between industry funds and retail funds, traditional investors, where there's more focus from ESG from the industry funds, and some of the more traditional investors still have the view that boards and companies should just focus on shareholder returns, whereas the industry funds tend to have the view that ESG is how you deliver those shareholder returns. And it's an interesting challenge for boards as to where are the boundaries on these debates. With climate change, I think it's clear, as Catherine said, we're not debating the what, we're debating the when and how, etc. But as you go down social issues, it becomes less clear. Same-sex marriage, as an example, was less clear. Some companies took a prominent stand. Others took the view that it was a matter for government and not for the company to use shareholder funds in that end. And I have a personal passion for the protection of the oceans and the destruction of coral reef habitats and things, but should I be influencing the company to use shareholder funds in the pursuit of that? Because I believe in that. I don't think I'm alone, but no, I think probably not. I think it's sort of going too far, but that's going to be an increasing topic on the agenda of boards as these social norms change so rapidly.
And John, how does that, sitting around a board table, what does that look like, that sort of conversation? Because as you say, it's going to become an increasing conversation as boards have to decide what's in their purview and what's not. What does that look like as a conversation? Who drives it?
Well, yeah, really good question. We had a lot of debate about that. On the one side, the company just has an obligation to make sure we follow the law, and it's not up for us to use shareholder funds to influence the social debate of the day. On the other side, there's a lot of passion amongst employees and stakeholder groups across the board that really wants the company to take a position on many of these issues. So we concluded in the end that, unfortunately, as often the case, there's no right or wrong and single answer. We really had to view it on a case-by-case basis and take a decision that we didn't want to be on the wrong side of history, and where we felt that this was a trend that ultimately was going to have a little dissent in society, then we should nail our colours to the mast and support it. But it really got to be case by case. It's too complicated to generalise.
Diane, do you agree? Do you think that it's case by case is the only way that you can really approach it?
Look, I agree with John on that. It's a bit of a bubble up process, isn't it, in the organisation? So, you know, the example that John used about same-sex marriage, and I was a very strong advocate for that because, you know, I believe in the social justice element of that as an advocate for gender equity. But in the organisations that I was involved with that were really prepared to step forward, because management had come with the notion that, yeah, Apple does love to integrate.
No, they integrate. You've got everything off. I apologise.
Yes. Yeah, put it on to do not disturb, or even better, flight mode. Because you can pretend you're on an aeroplane, and wouldn't that be nice?
Yes, all right. Anyway, I apologise. Please continue.
No, don't worry. So, you know, the organisations that I was part of that really got involved in the same-sex marriage conversation were those with large workforces, because we knew that 10% of Australians identify as LGBTIQ. I hope I haven't left anybody out in that acronym there. But that meant that 10% of your people felt that they were not able to bring their whole self to work because they weren't really included. And when you sit down and listen to someone who is not included, and as a woman where you haven't necessarily always been included, it's very quick to understand that dynamic. So I think when there is a real business purpose to be had from supporting the advocacy for these social issues, it's a very easy decision. It becomes harder when there are, you know, passion plays that may come up, as John has said, from either board members or executive or from your staff. And so I think having a very strong process to understand the mission and purpose of your organisation and to be able to tie that into your values.
I was just going to say, Catherine, is that even harder for a bank though, because you have to be increasingly conscious about the ESG concerns around all the assets that you fund?
Yes, but I mean, I'd come back on the E side, and obviously I'd reinforce the transparency point that I made in terms of understanding the impact of your financing and obviously the if you like, the glide paths to getting to the outcome under Paris. On the S side, I think it's actually organisations that take on, shall we say, particular issues that are less, I suppose, less front of mind for many people, but very serious. So, for example, domestic abuse and financial abuse. So that's something where certainly CommBank spends you know, a great deal of its S side, if you like, on the social side, because it's such a serious issue, but perhaps doesn't get, if you like, the significant debate that perhaps some other issues do get. But it's just crucial that we contribute to that from a societal point of view.
Can I go back to the issue of purview, John, in particular? There's a couple of questions. I know people are interested in this. Telstra's been making headlines of late because of your discussions that you're having about buying Digicel Pacific in partnership with the Australian government. If people haven't read about this, which I'm sure you have, but the worry is that China is going to buy the company. That's triggered security concerns. So the question has to be, John, are you a private company being used as a tool by the government to meet its foreign policy objectives?
To answer that directly, no, look, obviously I'm pretty limited as to what I can say. What I can say is that Telstra will not be making any investment that doesn't make sense for its shareholders and deliver adequate financial return. That's not just a platitude, that is an absolute fact. We will not enter into any transaction that isn't financially accretive. That said, can you help your sovereign government in current times, particularly if you're a critical infrastructure provider? Well, of course you can. The key is to try and find a balance between the two. And there's no decision made, there's no outcome yet decided, but if we can help government, we will, but we will not do it at the expense of shareholders' value.
It's a sticky one though, isn't it? I mean, the question would be, if you hadn't been approached by the government, would Digicel Pacific ever have come across your desk?
Probably not. It would have come across the desk, of course, like so many other things, but would it have been something one would have gone further in discussion with if there wasn't a government interest? Probably not. But you know, if something does come of this, it'll be because we can meet both government expectations and financial returns for the company. If we can't do both of those, then it won't happen.
Diane, can I ask you about that? Because it's a really interesting, I mean, I know Telstra, of course, the history of Telstra maybe puts it in a slightly different position, but it's still a private company. Working with government is not something that most shareholders would automatically think of as a path to value.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, Ali. You know, there are so many opportunities to work with government. I opened WA Business News the other day and was just looking at the ARENA and Clean Energy Finance Corporation and NAIF investments. You know, we work with government all the time. You know, they're prepared to help support certain infrastructure investments in certain places. So I think it's a very well-trodden path. And government does have very solid probity arrangements. Now, occasionally they stub their toes, triangles and so forth spring to mind. But in general, I think there is a very well-trodden pathway to be able to make these sorts of investments by having conversations and to work on things that are seen, where government plus business is a 1 + 1 = 3.
If only it was always that easy.
Oh, come on, glass half full. Give me at least one go at that in this conversation.
Absolutely. Catherine, can I ask you about the issue of engagement, and which we were talking about earlier, but the broader issue around engagement with investors? We're all aware of these proposed changes to the way proxy advisors operate, and that's pertinent given the hosts of this conference. I just wonder what your view is about what's being proposed.
Well, I think on proxy advisors, as a general comment, I think they have certainly have a role to play. So I think that would be the threshold point. And then I think it's how that role is discharged and getting good access to proxy advisors. I think it's very important for companies to have the dialogue and the conversation, and also to enable the proxy advisors to do their due diligence and their analysis thoroughly. So if you can get the access and the thorough analysis, I think you get the best outcome for all. And if proxy advisors then are clear about why they've made certain recommendations and they've made them on the basis of good knowledge and good engagement, I think that's a helpful outcome.
Does that mean that you essentially support the proposal that companies would have at least 5 days to, for want of a better word, to vet a proxy recommendation?
No, that's not what I said. The key is to have the access, which we do have in most cases, and also have the very professional analysis that's done of your business. Have the conversation, and then the proxy advisor will put together the report and make recommendations, which then hopefully are based on that good analysis and that good engagement. I'm not sure that the sort of 5 days to review the report, I'm not sure that adds a great deal if you get the first two elements correct.
John, what's your thoughts on what's been proposed, and have you seen evidence of poor practice by proxy advisors?
Well, I'd agree with Catherine. I mean, I think I have no issue whatsoever with proxy advisors and the role they play in the investment ecosystem. You know, if investors want that sort of advice from a third party, that's absolutely fine. I think the concern that is prominent in my mind is that, you know, if investors are relying on the information provided by those advisors, then I think the advisors should be held to the same levels of sort of accountability for quality and accuracy as the rest of the corporate world is. Most are pretty good, and if you point out an error in time, they will fix it. But you know, we've had a couple of examples where I carry the scars. Where, you know, one report that had 5 factual errors in it, including stating that the CEO's compensation had risen when it had actually fallen. And that particular advisor refused to engage with us until after the reporting season. So there was no possibility to actually influence that. And another case was quite egregious, where the proxy advisor got the CEO of Telstra mixed up with the CEO of Transurban, Scott Charlton, and made recommendations to their investor clients based on the wrong person and the wrong compensation package altogether. Now, I'm sure that doesn't happen all that often, but...
And we hasten to add, it wasn't AXI.
It most definitely was not. It most definitely was not. And again, even though we pointed out the error, they refused to correct it or engage until after the reporting season. So I just think if proxy advisors are advising investors, which is effectively what they're doing, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that they should be held to the same sort of standards as we are. If we made a mistake like that, we'd be jumped on rightfully by ASIC the next morning. So I think it should be a level playing field.
Diane, what are your thoughts? And if I can ask you specifically about the proposed change that would potentially see AXI removed from the market. This is the requirement that the advisors be meaningfully independent from a fund they're advising.
Look, the proxies play such an important role. The last thing we need is someone removed from the mix, and someone who plays the sort of role in the way they play it that AXI does. And I'm not saying that purely because we're sitting here on an AXI platform. But we know that around the board table, we're able to cope with directors who are not seen as independent. You know, the board has to make a determination around the independence or otherwise of every one of the directors, and we also have to have protocols in place for managing conflict. So we know how to identify it, we know how to manage it in that setting. I can see no reason why it's not possible to be able to manage through that particular issue. But I have had similar experiences to those that John has outlined, and it is very difficult. If I was to make a misstatement in my accounts or in one of the market updates from one of my companies, then I would be required, and I would naturally feel morally bound to make a correction, you know, on the ASX announcement platform the very minute that that issue came to my attention. And so I think when you're making the weighty recommendations that proxy advisors make, and when, you know, there are so many people relying on those recommendations, that they must be held to at least the same standard as the population of companies that they are reviewing. I think part of the issue, of course, is that we do have a very crowded reporting season. And so in a way, getting through the proxy engagement round, the proxies are a bit of a bottleneck. And there's a lot of work done to manage that, but it's just inevitable that this will occur. There will be issues, mistakes, and so we need to have some fail-safe on it.
I'm going to go to audience questions in just a minute, but I just wanted to get a comment from each of you around culture and value, I guess. And in particular, Catherine, I mean, still in our mind, so much has happened since Hayne, but it's still there. And just last week, of course, we saw those headlines where ASIC ruled out any criminal action against AMP for fees for no service. And I just wondered what you thought about what message that sent, and in the broader business community, whether the lessons of Hayne have been learned or learned and forgotten.
So I can't really comment on individual decisions by ASIC in that regard. But I do think if we go back to some of the fundamental points that came out of Hayne, I mean, there were 76 recommendations and they all sort of centered on particular aspects, but the core ones around remuneration and culture, I think they have been absorbed. We've seen a lot of change to remuneration systems, and not just in the financial services. We've seen increasing emphasis on understanding the culture in an organisation. And in culture, I would distinguish between the two elements of culture, one being the infrastructure side, which is your systems, policies and procedures, and the other being your people or behavioural side. So I really feel that those anchor points that came out of Hayne, I do think that they have been absorbed into the environment and action has been taken. I would also say, I think that the APRA Prudential Inquiry on CBA has had an impact, I mean, clearly profoundly on CBA, and it went to that point of culture and accountability and governance. So I think there's been something of a reinforcement between that APRA Prudential Inquiry and Hayne, and APRA sought to make sure that the lessons from the Prudential Inquiry were actually absorbed more broadly across the sector, and I think that has been the case.
John, can I ask you about culture and a very specific issue that's hit Telstra of late, of course, is that this penalty that you were hit with for the sale of mobile plans to around 100 Indigenous Australians, with the ACCC calling the behaviour unconscionable. I know that's a very small part of your organisation, but do you deal with that sort of thing as a cultural issue?
Certainly do, and to Catherine's point, I think we've all learned lessons and are continuing to learn lessons. And I would like to address the perception in some people's minds that boards and directors sit around scheming how they can disadvantage the public or be negligent in their governance. It can absolutely, surely it's not the case. We all try extremely hard, but we don't always get it right. And I think the banks were in the firing line of Hayne, but it could have been many other companies, including ones I'm involved in. But I think there are several influences, 2 or 3 things there. I mean, one is that companies have become very big over the years, and boards only meet for a day and a half every couple of months or whatever, and to actually be across every single aspect of every part of the company's activities is not easy. And the lessons one learns from these events is that we've got to be hugely more prescriptive in our analysis and diligence. And the second, I think, is that what you said in Telstra's case, it was only a small part. It was, and we sort of termed it the 1% issue, that while many of these disasters, reputational disasters, only represent a tiny fraction of transactions undertaken in banks or telcos or whatever, we've all been sort of trained and grown up with, if you're getting something 99% right, well, you're probably doing a pretty good job, so I don't have to worry too much. But all the damage is in that 1%. All the corporate reputational impact is in the 1% that we didn't bother about. So, that's made certainly, and okay, we almost reversed our process. We don't really need to look too closely at the 99 because I think management are dealing with that okay, but we need to know everything about the 1, which is a substantive change. And lastly, I think companies just, again, like our earlier discussion, reflect societal change. And a classic example of that is, buyer beware, caveat emptor. And if I go and buy a car and the salesperson tries to sell me the tinted windows and the sports wheels, and do I need those? No, I don't at all, but they try and sell me. And that's sort of, well, that's part of the course. And we all grew up with sales incentives and just get the sales done. Don't worry about anything else. That's completely reversed for big business to seller beware, and the level of responsibility that we have to customers and the general public means we have to completely reverse that. We don't incentivize salespeople on just getting a sale anymore. We're completely changing mechanisms so that we reward them on completely other factors. I think that reflects society as much as it does corporate culture.
Diane, do you think we're in a better place?
I think we are in a better place. you know, you started this question talking about consequence management and people's observations on consequences or otherwise, you know, in a particular instance, which, as Catherine said, none of us should comment on that. But I was one of 3 people who were asked by the Treasurer to enact one of the Hayne Royal Commission recommendations, which was to review the capability of APRA. And as a result of that experience, I was in direct conversations with the chairman, the CEOs and chief risk officers of each of the major banks. So with Catherine, I'm sure she'll recall that conversation, and with a fair sample of the regional banks. And the thing that struck me in terms of what differentiated the approach that the different organisations had taken, and I won't comment on who got a really high score and who didn't, was how you managed breaches, how you made sure that things that went wrong, the missteps and mistakes, were actually flowing up through the organisation to the board, through typically the audit and the risk committee or committees, and how that was actually managed, how the directors got themselves calibrated on whether across the organisation, if there was a mistake, that the consequences were appropriate, and the consequences were learning organisation consequences. It wasn't just, oh, well, this hasn't gone well, we'll get rid of a few people and problem solved. No, actually, what do we need to do to ensure this never happens again in the organisation? What do we do about removing delegated authorities from people? What do we do about changing remuneration systems, as John talked about sales remuneration systems? What do we do about retraining? What do we do about changing our processes? And I think that has been in many ways the lasting legacy of Hayne, which is a deeper conversation about how we make sure we are given the right information about what is going wrong, how we get calibrated, and how we make sure that the consequence is driving towards a sustainable organisation. Because it certainly wasn't restricted to financial services. I don't know of any large listed company that didn't take that capability review of or the conduct review of the Commonwealth Bank and mirror it for its organisation. Some were required to do it, but everyone did it no matter what, because it was such an important learning exercise.
So one of the most popular questions that we've got here from the audience, I'm just going to, well, actually, I'll put to you, John. You mentioned before about small business and how badly it suffered as a result of COVID. So what can big business, which has been a beneficiary, what can they do to help small business? And what are your thoughts about a universal living wage supported by business and government?
How long have we got, Ali? That's a big topic. I'd separate the two. What can business do? I think a lot of businesses bigger businesses are really helping already. I mean, in Telstra's case, for instance, we doubled down all the sponsorship arrangements of that a lot of organisations depended on. We continue to pay for cafes that shut in the lobby. You know, we don't just leave them to their own devices. We try to continue to support them. So we all have an ecosystem of small suppliers and businesses that we depend on. So I think business should continue to try to do their very best to help there. The universal living wage thing, I don't quite understand really the fundamental principle of it, that how it differentiates from existing social support structures. You know, I think for most of us, we don't need a living wage, and it just seems wrong that somebody in our position will get an additional level of income because it is now universal and every single person in the land receives it. Those who need that support should be getting it anyway. So I've always struggled with exactly what a universal income delivers, other than the requirement for those who are being supported not to have to go and look for work or do anything like that. But I tend to think, sadly, that society's always a mix of a lot of people who are lucky, fortunate, do well for a number of reasons, and a lot of people in the middle who can always do with a bit of support, but by and large are okay. And then there's a section of society that really needs, in a responsible, civilized country, to be looked after. And those people always will. I think even if you give a living wage, I'm not sure it'll change very much the situation of that lower group. And I think society just has to keep on doing everything it can to support and help them.
Catherine, I don't know whether you have a view on the living wage, but also a very specific question for you, given we were talking about digital competency of board members. Do you think there should be a technology committee on every board?
Ali, I've been in situations where we've had that and others where we haven't. And I think that the risk is that that not all directors then are included in the most significant decisions that can be made. And I think it compartmentalizes technology as somehow off to the side. So I think on balance, I'm not in favour of having a separate technology committee as a general comment, although there might be instances where for specific purposes it would be helpful.
And another question, I'll stay with you, Catherine. Can digital capability of trustees be lifted quickly? I mean, this is the question, isn't it? Can you teach it? Can you teach it fast? I mean, how do you get it?
Well, again, I mean, as Diane said, for boards, and including trustee boards, it's really important to have a continuous program of education across very specific topics and individual capabilities to build familiarity. So at CommBank, for example, we have at every meeting, we have a degree of education and, if you like, training for directors. And I think the same would apply to trustee boards. So you can build familiarity formally, but I think there's also an onus on directors to make sure that they are informing themselves, doing the necessary reading. And I mean, the degree of micro-credential courses you can do now is quite extraordinary. So there's really no excuse for people not making sure that they become more digitally conversant.
I'll put this question to each of you, and it's a nice question to finish with, really. Brennan Casey wants to know, boards of directors, what are your perspectives on companies requiring a social license to operate? I so feel social license to operate is one of those terms that's been around for a very long time. I'm not quite sure what it means in a practical sense around the board table. Diane, can I start with you?
Oh, thanks very much for that, Ali. Look, social license to operate, if you define it well, absolutely fine. But good heavens, aren't we talking about do the right thing? Understand what the mission of your organisation is, understand what the purpose is. As a board of directors, just as Catherine has said, get yourself really skilled, you know, do your work, hindsight, be sensible about the consequences you apply when things don't go right, and for heaven's sakes, aspire high. And social license to operate will trot along right behind.
John, is that a good assessment?
Very eloquently put. Look, I think, again, for those of us a little older, we grew up in a world of shareholder primacy, and where boards were required to trample over the bodies of newborn children to deliver financial return at any cost, with no real regard for how that was achieved. And those days are long since gone. And today, companies make up part of our total society ecosystem with a whole group of stakeholders, from customers, suppliers, employees, government, environment, etc. And it's a positive change. It's happened to all of us.
Catherine?
So, Ali, I'd probably go back to Hain and the should we test. And I think if you apply that consistently and constantly, you'll have the right outcome.
I know I said that was going to be the last question, but just in a very brief word or two, I'm very curious to know what you will all label as the biggest challenge around your board table for the next 12 months. What you can put on the table for us to discuss in another year's time when we come back for an ACSI conference. What's the one thing that you think will be dominant? John, if I start with you?
I think probably learning to live and operate in a new world post-COVID that will never go back to the world that we've seen before. Some positives, some negatives, but it will not be the same. And all companies will need to adapt.
Catherine?
I'd come back to digital, digital money, regulation of digital money. And you look at digital autonomous organisations, and so the emergence, as John said, of completely different frameworks and structures that are not at all familiar, and the rate of change in those.
Diane?
For me, it's something Catherine talked about earlier, which is the skills agenda. Because I think if business and government working together can get moving on solving the skills agenda, we will do a lot towards removing the need for a universal living wage and a lot towards being able to afford proper levels of income support. I think if we had proper levels of income support, we wouldn't be talking about universal living wage in the way that we do. So I would like to see that the skills agenda is flexed so that Australians can really look forward to lifetime employability in meaningful value-added jobs.
Look, we are out of time. A huge thank you to all three of you. I'm sorry that we're not all here in person, but a big virtual round of applause and a very big thank you for your time, Diane and Catherine and John. If you're working from home, it's back off to the kitchen with you. It's time for a lunch break with a big thank you to our lunch sponsor, S&P Global Market Intelligence, and I hope lunch is good at your place. We will be back here in just a little under 1 hour, reconvening at 1:30.